How to imitate even more closely a whole lot of Hollywood film music with one more easy step. Step 5. Go back instead of going forward. Right. I mean, up. Whatever. So we've learned how to count the distance between notes. It's like moving on a game board. But let's take a closer look at this game board. You may have already noticed that it has a repeating pattern, kind of like other game boards I can think of. On the piano game board, the pattern repeats after 12 notes. What this means is that any two pitches that are 12 notes apart, or some multiple of 12 notes apart, will sound quite similar to one another, like this and this. They can also substitute for one another. This suggests changing the layout of the game board from this to this. Here, we've wrapped the long and straight piano keyboard on an 88-note game board into a smaller and circular piano keyboard on a 12-note game board. On this game board, it doesn't matter whether you, for example, move forward 3 notes or move back 9 notes. You still end up in the same spot. I'm assuming that pass and go is not a priority. We do the same thing when we work with time. What's 11 hours after 3 o'clock? Well, if you use a 12-hour clock like we do in the US, you would say 2 o'clock, but it's a lot easier to get there by subtracting 1 hour rather than adding 11 hours. But here's an analogy that more of the world might appreciate. What's 11 months after October? Again, you could count 11 months later in time, but it's easier just to back up 1 month to September and then add a year on if you need to. This means 2 things for our tutorial on film music. First, for any note, you can replace it or add to it any note that is at a distance of 12 notes, either to the left or to the right, and that is down or up. Or, if we give ourselves a little more room, we can use a multiple of 12 as well. 24 up, negative 36 down. So that's one benefit. Here's a second benefit. You remember all those numbers that I used in the first video? Well, we can change any of them, the numbers from steps 1 and 2, or the ones from step 3, or both, by adding or subtracting any multiple of 12 that you choose. So here's an example from step 1. That 3, we can add 12. We can subtract 12. And those numbers will work just as well. From step 3, the number of notes in between roots, we can do the same thing. Subtract 12 maybe, add a multiple of 12, 24 in this case. We make such changes for 2 reasons. First, sometimes you can get the notes of the 2 chords closer together to one another, so the individual voices or fingers that play them don't have to travel quite as far. Okay, fine. Well, second, you can also create subtle changes and inventive variations in the sounds of these harmonies and the progressions while still invoking their association. Okay, fine. Sure, okay. Hey, there is another reason I'm doing this. Some of the examples I played in the earlier video could imitate the originals even more closely if we shuffle the notes around a little bit. Really? Well, I've been called worse. For instance, let's revisit the Fellowship of the Ring. And before I do anything else, let's start on the note that matches the original score. There we go. I feel better. Now, let's put that above. Good. And let's take a closer look at the first major triad. Now, we built that with 4-3, right? That was 4 notes up from the root. Good. And then 3 notes up from the second note, right? And that was just like I did it on the game board earlier, right? Move ahead 3 notes. Great. But let's mix it up a little bit. And let's change the 3 to a -9, just like I did on the circular game board earlier. So going back 9. This makes the triad's lowest note something besides the root, which is exactly what Howard Shore does, slightly altering and some might say destabilizing the sound of the major triad. Okay, so that's the first major triad, the first M of the label. Good. Now the next step, we're going to consider the 8 of the major, 8 major. Remember, this number means that we want to plant the root of the second triad 8 notes to the right of, that is higher than, the first root. And of course, that triad that we're going to plant is going to be a major triad because it's major 8 major. But it doesn't have to be 8 exactly. Subtracting 12 from 8 gives us -4. So we can just as well put the second chord's root 4 notes to the left of, that is lower than, the first root. Now, when we make the second major triad using 4-3, its notes will be closer to the notes of the first triad, so that on the piano you could even play all of them with one hand. In fact, the two chords are now sharing a note. And there it is, calling attention to itself, a little teetering there. So to show these chords more clearly, I'm going to divide them between two keyboards. So let's hear what this sounds like. I'm going to sing along while I play the piano, not with Enya's melody on top, but with the lowest notes on the bottom, highlighting the difference. Here's another example I used earlier. Parts of Hans Zimmer's score for this movie use a minor 11 major. That number 11 is pretty big, like counting ahead 11 months from October to September is a lot of work. So just like counting back 1 month is the same as counting forward 11 months, we can subtract 12 from 11 and kind of get the same music. Think of it like a minor -1 major. Like with Shore's music, this gets the pitches a whole lot closer together. In the previous video, I added a melody on top of this Dark Knight harmonic progression. I simply got the melody by duplicating a particular note in each chord 12 notes higher. Just a reminder, this is what it sounded like. So Zimmer has this cool harmonic progression, but how can he both reuse it and mix it up a little so that it doesn't sound exactly the same? Well, watch this. First of all, let's move the whole thing to the right. That is up 5 notes. As long as we move all notes by the same amount, even if it's not a multiple of 12, it will still be a minor 11 major. It would be as if we picked a different starting note. Next, let's give ourselves a little more keyboard at the bottom. There we go, a little more room. Now, let's move the top note in each chord down 24 so it's on the bottom, and move the bottom note in each chord up 12 so that it's on the top. Looks something like this. As long as we move individual notes up or down by a multiple of 12 notes, it will still be a minor 11 major. In music, we call this invertible counterpoint, because if you think of the piano only as a straight game board and not as a circular game board, we're swapping the positions of 2 of the voices. So once again, it looks like that. Let's listen to what this sounds like. Does it sound familiar? I mean, sure, yeah, it sounds a little bit like The Dark Knight, but it also has a sound all its own. Here's a hint. You know it now? Yeah. It's from Inception. In fact, this is the beginning of a progression used in Inception. A later movie from the same director, the same composer, again using a minor 11 major, but with a slightly different sound. You hear it, for example, when Paris starts folding over. So I think that's kind of clever. The city inverts and Zimmer's minor 11 major inverts from its use in Gotham 2 years before. See, you get it, the city inverts and the music inverts. Okay, I realize it's not perfect. But you have to admit, we've been accommodating some rather strange things up to this point. You know, for example, the fact that right is actually like up. I mean, come to think of it, that does remind you of Inception. No, whatever. Anyway, I hope you've enjoyed this video, and happy imitating. Bye.